So just a little bit about OUP. Everything we publish relates directly to our mission, to support Oxford University's objective of excellence in research, scholarship and education.
Language is at the heart of education, but in a rapidly changing world, it continues to evolve. Since 1908, Oxford University Press has supported Australian educators in developing children's language and literacy skills, with insights and learning resources underpinned by research and pedagogy.
Today, we're proud to partner with leading Australian language and literacy research experts to further our collective understanding of Australian children's language, share evidence-based research, insights and advice, and support the education community in developing our children's language and literacy skills. Join us at the home of Australian children's language.
Our presenters today are Dr. Tessa Daffern and Joanna Lake. Tessa has contributed to education in many capacities for over 20 years, as a classroom teacher in schools, a teaching and learning specialist, a literacy coordinator and academic, and an educational consultant. Tessa is currently Director and Principal Education Consultant at Literacy Education Solutions and has previously held academic positions at the University of Wollongong, the University of Canberra and Charles Sturt University. Tessa's PhD examined the teaching and learning of spelling and writing in Australian school contexts and involved almost 1,400 students across 17 schools. Joanna Lake is the Senior Publisher for Primary Literacy and Export at OUP ANZ and has recently worked with Tessa on a brand new whole school spelling program, Oxford Spelling.
Thanks, Chloe. It's wonderful to be here today. So I'll just start off by talking through the key things that we're going to cover today. We're going to look at, firstly, national spelling standards, where Australian students are currently in their spelling skill development, what research says about student spelling development. We're going to look at the implications for research and how educators can apply those in the classroom. And then we're going to have some time for some questions at the end. So I'll welcome Tessa now. Thank you for joining us, Tessa. I'm going to start off today by asking you to talk us through what national assessments are telling us about Australian students' spelling skills and development.
Sure, thanks, Joanna. One aspect of my PhD involved examining the contribution of spelling to compositional writing. So as one part of this process in my study, I analysed 4 cohorts of NAPLAN data to explore the relationship between the 3 language convention variables, so spelling, grammar and punctuation, to see how they relate to compositional writing as measured by NAPLAN. And the findings broadly indicated that spelling, grammar and punctuation, as you'd expect, do jointly influence writing, and that spelling is the main predictor of writing. So here are the results of those regression analyses, and just to sort of highlight that these statistics really specify that between approximately 24% and 43% of the variance in written composition is explained by those 3 language convention measures. And up here, the beta weights here indicate that spelling is the most influential factor in written composition across those 4 cohorts. And you can see that in particular, punctuation is not really significant. That's what NS stands for there, in influencing writing as an independent factor, and grammar a little bit significant in some cases, but generally spelling is a very strong influential factor in writing. I might also add that there are lots of other studies too that show how spelling can influence writing. For example, there's a study by some researchers by the name Sumner, Connolly and Barnett, and they found that spelling ability can influence vocabulary choices, and in particular the diversity of words that they use in their writing. And they also found that when students pause while writing words, it's explained by their poor spelling rather than poor motor skills like handwriting. And their study also found that as students are pausing to think of the spelling of a word, obviously it's leading to slower overall writing time and poorer compositional quality. So we know that learning to spell is challenging, and it certainly does take time to develop. And equally, instruction in spelling is complex, and it certainly demands robust pedagogical content knowledge on the teacher's part. This is a graph that really displays some longitudinal analysis of national NAPLAN data, and it broadly reveals some potential challenges with the teaching and learning of spelling. So this graph shows data from 6 cohorts of Australian students, beginning with the first cohort of students who were in Year 3 back in 2008 when NAPLAN first started. So across the 6 cohorts, the analysis shows the percentage of students who achieved either at or above the minimum national benchmark for NAPLAN spelling, and it shows how the percentages have changed over time for the 6 cohorts of students. And this is just based on the publicly available data that we can all access. And as a general guideline, we can see an overall decline in the percentage of students achieving at or above the minimum national benchmark for spelling. And certainly you can see this as students proceed to the high school years. So in Years 3 to 9, that's quite a stark decline, and it's consistent across 6 different cohorts over time. And we also know that other researchers found that proficiency in spelling has a highly consistent longitudinal influence on written composition across multiple years of schooling. And indeed, it's quite interesting to see that similar patterns of declining trends have been observed in children's writing. And I think that this sort of parallel with the trends with spelling and writing resonates with quite a large body of research focused on the cognitive processes of writing. Indeed, we know that difficulties with written expression may possibly stem from an inability to spell words that are really needed in order to express ideas with clarity, with precision. And it's also possible that these observed declines in NAPLAN spelling, particularly in the secondary school years, could be at least partly contributing to the parallel declining performance trends that we observe in NAPLAN spelling. This is quite well understood that more non-Indigenous students than Indigenous students seem to be achieving at or above minimum national benchmarks for spelling. And this is quite consistent across different domains. And here we can see that more girls than boys achieve at or above the minimum national benchmark for NAPLAN spelling. I might just add that these are really just those descriptives. They're not looking at whether there's a statistical difference between the boys and the girls here. But it gives us some trends across different cohorts. This is based on the 2019, the last NAPLAN spelling test that we've got data available for. Here we can see that there's a considerably lower proportion of students who live in remote and very remote locations in Australia who are achieving at or above the minimum national benchmark for spelling, so certainly compared to those who are living in major cities and regional areas. And this divide that we're seeing based on geolocation is even more pronounced in Year 7 and Year 9.
Well, it's really interesting to see these different statistics, and I think this correlation between spelling and writing and the importance of spelling, both in itself but also as it contributes to other parts of students' achievement. So just building on what we've had a look at, it would be great if you could walk us through the research in the area of triple word form theory, which we can see on screen here, and talk to us about how triple word form theory tells us about how students' skills in spelling develop.
Sure. So triple word form theory offers us a framework that can help us to understand how children learn to spell, actually the theory that informed my PhD. So according to this particular theory, there are 3 interdependent word forms, or processes I should say, that underpin the core aspect of language learning, that is spelling. And these processes are known as the phonological word form, the orthographic word form, and the morphological word form. According to this theory, students are able to demonstrate quite robust phonological word formation processes. And when they do so, they're mentally manipulating those spoken word forms and syllables and even their phonemes, which are the smallest speech sounds. So that's one aspect of spelling that is very important and is required for accurate and efficient spelling. But of course, we know that that's not the only process or skill involved in spelling. So there are orthographic processes as well, and they involve really knowing plausible graphemes, which is a letter or a group of letters that represent a phoneme, and even understanding their positional constraints, so knowing how a grapheme is dependent on the phoneme's position in the word. But also, spellers need to know about morphology. So morphological processing requires the ability to be able to reflect and analyse and manipulate the morphemic or meaning-based elements of words. And this includes knowing the function of those morphemes and how they can connect to produce different words. And there are many generalisations and rules that we can teach teach on morphology to help students connect these morphemes together. So morphological knowledge can also encompass knowing the meaning and the origin of those morphemic units of words. So students, according to this theory, are capable of learning to combine these three word forms from the early years of learning to spell, if that is what they're taught. And triple word form theory does differ to stage theories of spelling development, because it really suggests that student outcomes in spelling can certainly be enhanced if students are given those opportunities to learn about those three word forms in parallel rather than in sequential sort of linear or so-called stages. So learning to spell is quite a lot more complex than what stage theories seem to imply.
That's really interesting. And I think the main takeaway from this is that instead of, say, a building block approach from least complex to most complex, what we're saying is that students, if they're supported, are able to learn and incorporate these three different areas from really the very beginning of school.
Yes, that's right. I think that we still need to have a sequence that is cumulative and builds on different concepts, but with some explicit teaching. For example, children can learn some very basic, fundamental morphological concepts even before they've completely mastered their phonological skills. So they might be developing those concurrently.
So it'd be good to talk now about some current Australian research and what it's revealing about student spelling development. So could you start by talking to us about the recent 2020 New South Wales Professional Learning Pathway using the components of spelling test?
So last year I was involved in a large-scale professional learning pathway or initiative, and this involved nearly 300 educators from across New South Wales and their students. So there were about 72 public schools across New South Wales involved in this pathway. And I guess this project, there were a few aims of this project, but one of them enabled me to build on my earlier research on my PhD by developing a new assessment tool called the Components of Spelling Test, which is based on triple word form theory, and it allows students to assess using an error analysis and provide that detailed analysis for teachers to inform their instruction. So this particular pathway focused on assessment-informed practices for teaching spelling in the early years, and as part of this initiative, the spelling skills of almost 2,500 students in Year 1 and Year 2 were analysed using this Components of Spelling Test for the early years, or the COSTI. So in its totality, as you can see, it's quite a big test. It involves analysing about 170 words altogether that students actually write. Then the actual analysis involves looking at the phonological, orthographic and morphological components of spelling to identify students' specific skills and areas that need to be addressed. And as you can see here, the assessment aligns with triple word form theory because it's got those three components there. And so just quickly to give you some context, through that pathway I was able to check the reliability of the test to make sure it is robust to use. And I also have developed an online platform that enables teachers to enter the words that students write, and then a comprehensive error analysis is automatically generated along with correlating instructional recommendations for each student. So that saves a lot of time for the teachers, and then they can go straight into planning their lessons and teaching. So for the purposes of today, I won't really have time to go into the nitty-gritty of that, but there are details on my website if you wanted to have a look, www.tessadaffern.com. The results here draw on data from students just in Year 1 and in Year 2 who completed all three components of that test, and these are the mean accuracy scores for those three components. And just broadly, as you can see, that children are typically, say in Year 2, are performing better than students in Year 1, which is what you would expect to see. But interestingly, you can see that the phonological component is yielding quite strong scores. This is based on just this set of words that are tested. And when you look at the orthographic and morphological components, there is certainly a lot of scope for learning in these two areas. So these results here provide a bit of a breakdown of the phonological component of that test. In the test for this component, there's two parts. First part just involves writing very regular one-syllable words. So it gives us some insight into how students are spelling these real words, but you take it in connection with other sources of assessment. It just gives us one piece of information. It gives us an idea of the progression of skills that we're seeing in these early years. So as expected, students are pretty good at spelling first consonant phoneme in a regular one-syllable word. A little bit harder are those final consonant graphs, or that is a single-letter grapheme for a phoneme. A bit harder are those short vowel single-letter graphemes, but then blending consonants either at the start of a word or at the end of a word, as well as knowing consonant digraphs, are more problematic for these students. So individual data would yield even further details about where those gaps might be. But this gives teachers, I guess, a broad insight into where priority areas could potentially be when they're targeting intervention and supporting students. So these are just one-syllable words. This slide here shows you those students who performed above the mean in those one-syllable words are represented in this graph. And so this basically is showing you that there are some students who are doing quite well at spelling those one-syllable words. That is represented here by the part A. So they're doing very well, but what's letting them down is capacity to spell those two-syllable words where the middle part of the word is phonologically regular. There's nothing tricky about it. It follows a very simple one-to-one phoneme-grapheme correspondence using a very, the initial code basically, and they're not accurately representing those words. So there's a bit of an issue of them being able to blend through and segment through those longer words. So even students who are doing quite well are struggling with that aspect in the early years, which is to be expected, I guess, because the longer the word, the greater the cognitive load, and phonological working memory is kind of getting in the way and making it difficult to spell these words accurately. And so there's a lot here to digest, but essentially what this is showing is the level of detail that students can demonstrate in terms of their orthographic skills. So a lot of the items in this component of the test look at vowel, for example, vowel phonemes and all the different ways to spell those vowel phonemes, as well as some of those positional constraints that I was talking about before. And there is a lot of individual variance in what students demonstrate, and so that's why targeted approach is really quite important. But some of the trends that I've observed are that certain types of graphemes, like the or in warm, is quite easy for students to represent, through to, certain types of vowels that are quite a lot more difficult to represent for some students. But you'll probably find that every class will demonstrate a different set of patterns, especially with orthography. And I think it's largely because of what's taught. So if it's taught, then hopefully the students will demonstrate those skills. But you can see there's a huge scope of different things that you need to work on in the early years, or can work on, to refine spelling. The next slide here shows you the morphological component for the early years, again based on this test and the set of words. And some of the findings from this set of data seems to parallel what I've seen in other studies from other researchers. But one thing that I did notice was that students are pretty good at spelling some of those simple prefixes that are quite regular, like re and pre. So compared to some of the other morphological features, certain types of prefixes are not too hard for some students to spell, even though there are gaps in their phonological and orthographic areas. And I also noticed that certain types of suffixes are easier than others. So for example, those tense marking suffixes that mark tense and plurals as well tend to be a bit easier than some of the other suffixes. And that's quite consistent with other research as well. But notably, I found that homophone knowledge was one of the poor areas in this set of data, among other things. But there are lots of high-frequency words that are homophones, and they take time to learn. And I think that there is a need to explicitly teach those homophones throughout all of the years of schooling, starting with those high-frequency homophones and perhaps aligning them to a phoneme-grapheme correspondence that you are teaching as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see here, even looking within these subcategories of phonology, orthography and morphology, that then there is the subcategories within those and the explicit teaching and modelling that's needed around some of these key categories where students do need support, because there are some that are going to be more easily taken up, but then others, such as homophones, which you've just looked at, that need that continual practice and the introduction of more and more as students build up their vocabulary knowledge.
Yeah. And I guess homophones are included in this particular component because each homophone is a morpheme, and in order to know the spelling of that homophone, you need to know the meaning of that word. So it really does rely on that morphological knowledge. So it does need to be addressed.
So we've had a look at some results here for the early years. Can we take a look now at the research that's looked at years 3 to 6, so we can see some comparisons between the first half and second half of primary?
Yep. So this data comes from the components of spelling test for years 3 to 6, which was the very first test that I developed as part of my PhD. And since then, I've now developed a pseudo-word version of this and then also gone to the early years. So it works in the same kind of way. It's informed by triple word form theory, and there is an online platform that saves teachers a lot of time to be able to just automatically generate that analysis report and then align it with instructional recommendations for each student. So based on that test, I'll share some of the data. And this slide just simply shows you how that test is structured. So across the 3 word forms, the students actually write 70 words. They are real words, but like I said, I do have a pseudo-word version of the test as well, which has a similar kind of structure and has gone through that reliability testing. But in total, across these 3 components, there are a number of constructs and a bit over 100 items that are analysed. So using that, I'll share some of the data if that's okay. It comes from my PhD, and the sample of students is broadly representative of Australian students in years 3 to 6 based on the sampling technique that I used. What you see here is the mean accuracy score for those 3 components. And similarly to what I shared with you with the early years, you can see that the phonological component and the orthographic component, they're fairly strong, but morphology is certainly clearly that weak point across all the year levels. Nevertheless, you can see that there is growth occurring across the year levels. And so what I might do now is to share with you a breakdown of those 3 components, because that yields a little bit more insight into what's going on. So this is just the phonological component, and no surprise, basically students from year 3 accurately representing initial and final consonants with no issues. They're generally, well, there are some students who may not be, but in general you would expect that they're fine with that, and if they're not, then quite well behind where they should be. They're also representing those short vowel phonemes represented by single letters, and generally you should expect no issues there for year 3, 4, 5 and 6. The same thing with those consonant digraphs. But what I did notice was that students still learning to blend across syllables and across phonemes in words that are longer, so those polysyllabic words. And the items that were assessed here, they're all real words, but I only analyse, or this test only provides an analysis of just the middle part of those words where there is a one-to-one phoneme-grapheme correspondence. And so there's nothing tricky about that part of the word except for the fact that it's in the middle of a long word. So you would think that if a student has good, let's say, phonic knowledge and they know their phoneme-grapheme correspondences, the question here is, are they applying that knowledge when they're spelling these longer words? And it seems as though maybe they're not, and there is certainly scope for students to improve in this area, which really broadly suggests that one of the things that teachers might focus on is segmenting phonemes, but also breaking words up into syllables to reduce that cognitive load. So that's one key area. And so even students who, this data doesn't show it, but even students who are performing up in the 90th percentile, there was still scope for them to improve in that area. And once again, like the early years, it aligns with students' phonological working memory skills. And here is a bit of a breakdown of the orthographic sub-skills. And you can see a bit of a trend over here. So the common long vowels are like oo and e, and ambiguous vowels actually, I have to say, weren't so ambiguous in the end, because they were things like the diphthongs like oi, as in the word boil, where there's probably less graphemes to choose from. So I could write oy as opposed to oi, and there aren't too many alternatives. So certain vowel phonemes are harder to spell than others. And again, there is individual variation in all of this. These are just the mean accuracy scores. But spelling 2-syllable words that have an unaccented final syllable, there's a sequence of letters in there where you'll have a schwa in there, which is a type of vowel phoneme. And sometimes the letters used to represent the phonemes in that final syllable can be quite obscure or a bit tricky to know how to spell. So, for example, the word bottle, it ends with L-E, but when I say the word bottle, the last letter is not an L. So it kind of goes against this, very initial code. So that can be quite confusing for students to know, what letter patterns to use for those kinds of words. And you can see that evidenced here. So that's some insights there for orthography. We might move to morphology. The next slide, please. And so this is the morphological component. And here, like in the early years, those inflected suffixes, which were some tense and plural marking suffixes, had a stronger representation. The students were pretty good at that. But derivational suffixes, which are all those other ones that change the part of speech, like ION, for example, were the weaker area. Nevertheless, students are making quite big gains from year 5 to year 6, and that could be because maybe that's where the instructional priority is. As students get older, teachers are teaching morphology a little bit more, so you're seeing evidence of that growth there. But one area that was particularly troublesome was homophones, once again, and certain types of prefixes called assimilated prefixes. So one of the other points that I've noticed in this data set was that students are basically finishing primary school without having entirely mastered all 3 components, and morphology is certainly the weaker area. So there's a lot of students going in to high school with a lot more that they can learn in spelling, yet it's perhaps not addressed enough or maybe even at all in the early secondary years, which might partly explain why we're seeing that decline in spelling and perhaps writing as well.
So we've just looked at 3 sets of information around student spelling in Australia. National assessment results, we've looked at 2 research studies that give us data on student spelling from early to upper primary. So I'd really like to discuss now how we can take this research and the information that you've shared with us about triple word form theory and translate this into some practical teaching support. So you've had really broad experience ranging from being a classroom teacher, a teaching and learning specialist, an academic focusing on spelling, and now as an educational consultant. What insights can you provide to us about how you think we can take this research and apply it in the classroom?
I'd like to perhaps share just some general guiding principles and for teaching spelling. And I guess these have really come about through my ongoing research, but also the work that I do with teachers on the ground every day these days. It's been fabulous to be working with so many teachers across different schools and mostly online. But I've been able to gain a lot of insights through a culmination of all of the work that I've done over the years. Most recently, I had a paper published, it's shown on the bottom of this screen, in a journal called the Australian Journal of Learning Difficulties. And this was an intervention study, and it involved mainstream classrooms, mainstream schools, mainstream students, and there were 4 schools involved, and I had 2 schools involved in an intervention and 2 schools that were following a business as usual approach. And essentially, these sort of guiding principles stem from those research findings. And so basically, what I found is the first step is that it's important to have a whole school approach, something that's consistent, and that might begin with developing a philosophical statement where the school decides what is important about spelling and how do students learn to spell. Are we going to take on an approach that is following that stage approach, which takes on a Piagetian notion of spelling development, which actually, when you do look at the research, there's not really that strong empirical evidence to support that view? Or as a school, are we going to acknowledge that within explicit teaching that students are capable of learning across multiple word forms from the early years of learning to spell? So deciding on what that approach is and making that consistent across the whole school is really critical, first starting point. And the other thing I have noticed too is that in order to sustain good practice or to develop good practice and then sustain it, we need to make sure that the teachers are well supported. They need to have strong pedagogical content knowledge. So they need to know their students, they need to know the linguistics about spelling, they need to know how to explicitly teach using that meta-language, they need to know how to use assessment data to inform teaching priorities, and they need to know how to use that in a way that is very effective. So it's quite complex. A number of studies have showed that teachers need to learn a lot of these linguistic skills. It's complex, it takes time to develop, but there is a need to build that pedagogical content knowledge. Following that, if teachers do have that confidence and knowledge to teach spelling in a linguistically informed manner, then they will feel well equipped to be able to then undertake error analysis that is systematic. So moving away from just providing a list of words for students to learn and memorise and then obtain a score out of 10, which really doesn't inform your practice. So using error analysis to inform teaching is really quite critical. And in fact, the teachers in the intervention study, all of those classes made statistically significant gains. And the key factor really was those things, that refining their pedagogical content knowledge, using systematic error analysis to inform what to teach and who to teach that to. And then the explicit teaching needed to happen. Really, the more you do it, the more you explicitly teach, the stronger the gains will be. So teaching across those 3 word forms, we aimed to do an explicit teaching episode across the 3 word forms every week. And then that explicit teaching was very much not just random, it was very much informed by error analysis. Explicitly teaching also involves knowing what the outcome of the lesson should be, so making learning intentions very clear, and modelling and using the meta language, but also providing opportunities for students to cross-map. So that basically means perhaps doing a very deep word study, and it could be once a week or once a fortnight, where the teacher might model how to unpack a word from a phonological lens, and then from an orthographic lens, and then from a morphological lens. So the students start to learn that spelling a word may involve integrating or connecting multiple word forms in order to get to the correct spelling of a word. And the other element of teaching, I think, needs to be that it's not just that you explicitly teach something once. Students need multiple opportunities to practice, to consolidate over several days. And some students will need more intense consolidation and practice in order to keep up. Others might learn it more quickly. So teaching needs to be responsive to how students are responding to the teaching that you're providing them.
I might just ask a little bit more about meta language, because I know this is something that comes up a little bit, and sometimes for teachers it can be a little bit difficult at the beginning with meta language. So can you talk a little bit more about perhaps some tips for using meta language for teachers, and also the benefits of using spelling meta language for students in the classroom?
So I think that in the very early stages of learning to spell, in the early years, it's helpful for teachers to start with everyday familiar language and integrate that with some of the meta language. I have written an article with an actual classroom teacher in the first year of school that illustrates the power of using meta language for 5-year-old students, and moving from talking about, this is a sound that I can hear in this word, a speech sound, to this is a phoneme and this is a base word and this is a suffix. So providing lots of examples to illustrate while using that meta language can help. But if a school is introducing some meta language from the very beginning, from kindergarten, or the first year of school, I should say, then students will gradually become familiar with the key meta language. So, for example, if I were to introduce the consonant digraph SH, I need to use that word consonant digraph, and I might say that di means 2, so 2 letters that represent one speech sound, and I provide that example. And so students are capable of learning that meta language if the teacher uses that meta language on a regular basis.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Tessa. We've got a short amount of time now for questions.
You can always send questions through to us at marketing.au@oup.com, and we can pass them on to Joe or Tessa or any of our sales consultants who'll be able to answer the questions for you as well.
There's a question here, is Oxford producing resources to support this? Well, as I mentioned, or we mentioned at the beginning, we do have a new series, Oxford Spelling. Tessa, did you just want to say a few short words about your work on Oxford Spelling?
Sure. I met Joanna several years ago when I was presenting a workshop to teachers, and it kind of stemmed from that, where we recognised that there was a need to support teachers. So I do have the components of spelling tests, and that has been very useful for teachers to plan and form their teaching. But many teachers have also said, is it really possible to get something that is quite sequential and quite prescriptive, I guess, but still allows for scope for differentiation. And so through that, work together to develop some resources on spelling that I think are going to be coming up fairly soon. And
yes, they are. They're available now, actually. And if you are interested in finding out more, I can pop onto our website, but also talk to our sales consultant. Yes, as Tessa mentioned, we met a few years ago, and it's been such a pleasure working with her on this new series. There's some wonderful tie-ins to some of the areas that Tessa was talking about in her implications of the research in the classroom in Oxford Spelling, particularly around focusing on those key areas of phonology, orthography and morphology, and really to help support students and teachers in the classroom. And as Tessa mentioned, it's really being kept in mind that teachers are facing a range of skills in their students in the classroom. So inbuilt into that is lots of opportunity for that practice and consolidation, warm-ups, and lots of extension and post-series activities that are flexibly workable in the classroom. There's information on that on our website, or you can speak to your sales consultant as well.
I might just also say the teachers have also been using the assessments. So if anyone wanted to find out any more about that, or any of the journal articles that I've referred to, I do have a reference list available on my website that includes some of those references that might be informative for you as well.
Great. Yes, we can make those available. Tessa did talk through a few research articles, so we can definitely get some links for that. I've got a question here which was about differentiation from Janet. How do you cater for students that are at various levels within one year level when using your resources? Are they sold in year levels? So we have produced the resources in year levels. Obviously, it's possible to switch between different books for certain students if you feel that that would work. But what we also have done is, alongside the student work, is some really supportive teacher resources that Tessa has written. Tessa's written the full series, all teacher support notes and the student books. And there's a lesson plan for every suggested lesson, and that includes tips for how to deal with students who are working at various levels. So approaching activities in different ways. There's some tips for explicit teaching, reminding students how to approach certain spelling skills or words. And as I said, there's some warm-ups. There's also suggestions for using literature to get students ready for certain activities. And then there's also sort of extension and consolidation. So there's suggestions for what, if you've completed an activity and you're seeing that some students maybe aren't picking up that skill to the level that you would like to see, then there's a sort of what's next step. So going back for more practice, and that's generally using other types of activities that practice grouping words, and we provide a lot of digital resources that sit alongside the printed resources that you can use for that as well.
That's where also that ongoing assessment is really important. So you might do a big assessment at the start, and then as you're teaching, so that big assessment gives you a good sense of, where the gaps might be. And that's where I know teachers have used the assessments that I've developed. But then ongoing assessment needs to occur all the time so that you can adjust your teaching accordingly and be flexible with how you might be using those resources. Because as you say, there might be some students where an activity is just too challenging, they're not ready for it, or you might need to move back and take a step or make it more complex. And you won't know that unless you are actually monitoring progress and being systematic about that through some sort of error analysis.
Yeah, so as Tessa's mentioned, error analysis is really important, and she, her PhD has focused on that and developing some resources around that. And Oxford Spelling also has some assessment components to allow you to check in throughout the year, which can help you build that evidence and show you where you need to go with your teaching. I think we've just got time for one last question. So there's one here from Karen. Have you done any work on the best way to provide feedback on spelling errors that appear in students' writing tasks? Ticks above correct letters and only the incorrect digraph, rewrite the whole word correctly, or do you limit the amount of spelling correction to students?
So I do have some templates to analyse students' writing, and it uses triple word form theory as that framework, and they are provided in the manual with the components of spelling test. So rather than marking students' work directly, I would rather use a separate template for myself as a teacher to analyse the errors. And then what I would perhaps do is then draw on that material and say, okay, these are the common errors that I'm seeing, so that's going to be what I'm going to focus my instruction on. And if I know I have taught something explicitly and I'm seeing a particular error come up in a student's writing that they should really be getting that right because I've taught that, then I would have a very quick conference with the student and remind them about what we've learnt and correct the spelling for them. So if I am going to mark up anything in their writing, I'm going to be quite strategic about that and focus on drawing attention to where the errors are if really I shouldn't be seeing those sorts of errors because I've taught that skill. So I hope that addresses your question there. But yeah, certainly having some kind of template or framework to be able to analyse students' writing is really helpful because otherwise it's quite complex to do it without that sort of framework.
Thanks so much, Tessa. If you have any other questions, as my colleague mentioned, please email marketing.au@oup.com and we can help answer any further questions there. Thanks so much, Tessa, for your time today. It's been so fantastic to talk to you and just a fantastic chance to hear from you, from your experience in spelling. And thanks to everyone for joining us today.